Moscowitz, Monday through Friday, 10 to midnight Eastern Standard Time. Dooovid is here with us as he is on Thursday evenings. Let me call up the chat room over at YouTube. So Dooovid, I mean, unfortunately, the news is pretty grim. We talk about Israel issues, Jewish American issues, and it does appear that there's an uptick of terrorism in Israel, that people are going out and trying to murder as many Jews as they can. Let me just shut down my something here. That
trying to murder as many Jews as they can.
Yeah, I'll let that one go over the air. Okay. And you seem to say that you have information that indicates that as we enter into Ramadan and Passover in the next 2 weeks, it's going to get worse. It's going to get international. It could end up visiting the shores of the United States. And we'd all better protect ourselves. What's going on?
Yeah, God forbid. I mean, every year in Israel during Ramadan is your peak time for possible incursions. You know, last year, or it was 2 years ago, when there was violence, even the rockets. It was during Ramadan, and it culminated with the last day of Ramadan. And I mean, we talked about this before. If you want to look at anti-Semitism versus sort of say anti-Zionism, and looking at us at war with Islam to some extent. So God forbid, Ramadan occurs, people take their Islamic sentiment stronger, and there's more likely to be attacks. So God forbid, there were three major attacks that had multiple casualties. The first one was two of them were claimed responsibility by ISIS, and so it's unclear like if ISIS has been reestablished or how they're doing it. The first one was committed, God forbid, by a Bedouin Israeli citizen, and I guess like a ramming stabbing attack. There was another stabbing attack you're right in Jerusalem where I guess Orthodox Jewish citizen you shot the perpetrator. And then in Bnei Brak, in the Orthodox area, there was a person with a machine gun that gunned down 5 people, including a police officer. In fact, there were 4 attacks. There was another one in northern Israel with another gun attack, and 2 police officers were killed. And it's very difficult to know what to do. At least one of them was an Israeli citizen. Maybe there was a stabbing attack. There was also an Israeli citizen. Others were snuck past the border, and so now Israel, I believe, all of the terrorists were killed, or not even arrested. They got killed in those attacks, but they were helped, and so Israel is going into like their towns and trying to find collaborators and weapon stashes, and leading to further violence in Jenin. There was more killed. I think an officer was seriously injured, and Palestinians were killed. And so it's tough. It's tough, from Israel's perspective. Do they try to squash it by trying to find out who these people are and arresting the relatives and collaborators, even though that increases violence and there's been more warning? Or so Ramadan hasn't even started. It starts this weekend, and so God forbid. And I just checked the Jerusalem Post. The security experts in Israel have said that they expect over Ramadan, the next 30 days, that there will be attacks on Jewish communities all over the world. God forbid.
Well, I mean, we could talk more fundamentally about what it is about Ramadan that leads them to want to murder Jews. And I think that in a mild sense, it makes me think, quite frankly, of the pre-World War II Christian position, particularly the Catholic position, and I say this with due respect, where Good Friday was often a day that they would go out and start beating up Jews. Now, they weren't, my father talked about this as a young man in Boston. that there'd be, the Jews would get together and basically fight back, and there'd be street scuffles.
I
And
remember in New York, one rabbi used to warn people not to go out on
yeah,
Christmas and New Year's. And like then it was kind of like, are you serious? Like I didn't even heard of like a Jew getting beat up on Christmas. But
I think it was more something
rabbi,
about, there was something about Good Friday that where this whole philosophy, that the idea that the Jews are responsible, the Christ killers, and that we bear the mark of Cain for this. I mean, the ideas that are pushed now by Dr. E. Michael Jones and a few others, that I would argue, and I think that after World War II, and after there was a sense, frankly, of guilt in the Christian world, the Christianity abandoned much of that, and that kind of receded. But it does seem to still be around in Islam. And Ramadan, they feel like, hey, here's a day to go out and kill Jews and take a machine gun and blow their heads off. This kind of bizarre and in-coat rage that is completely, that somehow people in the name of their religion and in the name of God feel compelled to go out and murder people, particularly Jews. I don't know, I don't know if we want to go too deep into theology. We probably don't, because we don't understand Islam. But from a practical standpoint, let's just talk about what to do. In Israel, I assume that the Israeli government has enough intelligence resources to know who is, who are the major players. Now, they can't stop every single person. Ultimately, if somebody wants to take up a gun and go in and start blowing people's heads off, there's not much you can ultimately do about that. You can't control a person's brain and their motivations. But there are things that Israel could do to cut it off at the pass with the use of intelligence. And also, we should note that the Israelis are very well trained in the use of guns. Since the Ma'alot murders in 1973, when a nursery school was overtaken by terrorists and 50 children were killed, the Israelis have learned that they all have to know how to use guns and carry guns, and U.S. military personnel are required to take their guns home when they're not on duty. And that includes grandboobies and zadis and grandparents. Since Ma'alot, Israeli boobies and zadis guard nursery schools and schools, and they know what they're doing. You don't mess with them. If they see somebody coming around with that kind of intent, they know how to spot them and they know how to neutralize them. And all I can say is that I hope that the Israeli people continue with this kind of vigilance, which is natural and normal, especially in their situation, and that they're ready to take up arms and stop any attempt by people who want to murder Jews. And that may extend to us here. Look, I'm not going to comment personally on whether or not I know how to use a gun or whether I even have a gun, because that's personal. But I will say that it would not hurt us at all to develop training and to develop skills in self-defense. Because, this is the reality that we live in. It always has been. This isn't, this is real life. There's no such thing as a nice little utopia. We always have to defend our lives and our freedom. So I just hope in this time of Passover and with a ramping up of violence, we are prepared as individuals to defend ourselves.
Yeah, well, we've talked about this before, and say that Israel does not consider this anti-Semitic. It's terror. It's politically motivated, and even if it's internationally, like this is specifically related to Israel policy and has a political goal. The goal is not necessarily to inflict harm on Jews or random outrage at Jews for religious reasons. It is specifically political, and it's specifically related to trying to get the state of Israel to change its course of action. And
And what would that
This is
change?
the Israeli position, because
Yeah, I understand that. And we have talked about this before.
that
I would suggest that
they're not considered anti-Semitic. They're considered
I'm sure
terrorists,
they're not.
and their purpose, even if they're killing civilians, innocent civilians, some of them women, mothers, they have a political purpose.
Yeah, to destroy Israel.
Already heavily armed. Like a lot of these were gunfights. Multiple police were killed in these gunfights. There were 2 stabbing attacks and gunfights, and 2 of the terror attacks, armed Israeli police officers that went to handle the situation were killed. So God forbid, 3
I remember that. Yeah.
Israeli police officers this week were killed trying to stop the armed terrorists. So I mean, God forbid, like, it's not a lack of guns in Israel. The stabbing attack was just a random
Right. Well, ultimately, you can't stop somebody.
that was armed.
Dooovid, ultimately, as I said, you can have all the guns in the world, and you still can't stop somebody if they want to kill you, because you can't know it's impossible. And so but that doesn't mean you shouldn't have the guns to at least reduce the threat and to neutralize it when it comes. Now, as far as I understand Israel does not want to call the terrorists anti-Semitic. I mean, I get that. They're political militants who want to destroy the state of Israel. I would suggest that is anti-Semitic, because their dislike of Israel and their hatred of Israel is because it's a Jewish state. And as far as you say they want to change the situation of Israel. Yeah, indeed, they want to destroy Israel. Was it any different before the 1967 war? No, it was worse. And that's when Israel had what Foreign Minister Abba Eban accurately called Auschwitz borders. So no, it's not. This is, there is an agenda there. It's to destroy Israel. And that, I suppose in the technical sense, you could say it's not anti-Semitic, because their vision of the Jewish people and of Judaism as a religion are a people that are completely subservient to their rule. And this is absolutely true in Islamic countries, that the Jews have to take on dhimmi status. They don't have the same rights as everyone else. They cannot, traditionally the Jews had to wear a special article of clothing. They couldn't get on a horse. They couldn't build a synagogue. They couldn't own property, and their testimony was not valid in a courtroom. But and Christianity, I think, used to have those same rules. It changed after World War II. When you had the Catholic idea of Sicut Judaeus non, the Jew would be allowed to practice his faith, he'd be allowed to continue unmolested, but he'd have no rights, and that he would not be allowed to hold prominent positions because he was, the Jew was the mark of Cain. I suppose in that sense, you could say it's not anti-Semitic. But in a world view, if we were to exist in an Islamic country, if Israel lost its sovereignty, you and I couldn't do this radio program right now. We couldn't have any position of influence, or we'd be killed, or we would likely be killed. So yeah, sure, not anti-Semitic, okay? I would suggest that I understand Israel's position. They don't want to have a war against Islam. Just like George W. Bush said, referred to Islam as a religion of peace after the 9/11 attack, and everybody knew that was a load of BS, but he had to do it because, do we want to have World War III? Do we want to have complete, total, open, kinetic war? No. So I get that. That has to be their position. But we are not Israelis. We are free people here, and we can say what it is. Yes, it's political, but it's also anti-Semitic. Anyway, Dooovid, what a depressing subject as we enter into the Passover season.
Even to make it worse, God forbid, catch and release in New York. Israel does have intelligence, does monitor people, and most of these people have long rap sheets and have been in and out of Israeli prisons. But God forbid, there's tens of thousands of Palestinians that have been in and out of Israeli prisons that are constantly on social media saying borderline incitement to violent things. Even the funeral for the terrorist was, I believe, attended by tens of thousands of people and celebrated, and even Benny Gantz tried to get Mahmoud Abbas to denounce the terrorist family, and even he wasn't willing to denounce so it's really borderline war. So as I say,
Right.
I mean, to put it in the American situation, you say like you could consider it anti-Semitic, but like it's different. We're at war, and it's very clear who we're at war
You're hating
with.
more.
And there's hundreds of thousands of people that are actively in opposition. There's tens of thousands of people that have been in and out of Israeli prisons, and ISIS. Like two of these guys declared allegiance to ISIS, and saying like, well, it's the Middle East, and ISIS is operating there, and it's Ramadan, and there are going to be tens of thousands of Muslims at the Temple Mount every day, and the fact is, there's going to be provocations by Jews. There's I think this Sunday, God forbid, there's going to be one of the right-wing members of Knesset is going to be going to the Temple Mount, and so Ramadan, because it's a pilgrimage holiday and it's an international Muslim pilgrimage holiday, it creates international focus on Israel, and then you're going to look at let's say that you would like to say, okay, we're not at war with Islam, and the vast majority of peaceful Muslim pilgrimage are going to be able to make it to the Temple Mount to pray, but to some extent, like, well, it's not that simple. There is an extreme right in Israel that doesn't like Ramadan, that doesn't like tens, hundreds of thousands of Muslims,
and for good reason,
coming to Jerusalem, and is a tinder bed.
Yeah, for good reason. It's dangerous.
War, into saying like, yeah, it's Ramadan, and all eyes. Well, I mean, more in Mecca, but like relatively.
Yeah, go to Mecca.
All eyes are going to be on Jerusalem, and the focus is going to be, God forbid,
it's the Jewish capital.
Israel oppressing Muslims, at least from that perspective.
They should oppress them. It's dangerous to have tens of thousands of Muslims in Jerusalem. It's the capital of the Jewish state and the Jewish people. I mean, it's not that they don't have a right to live position.
There. Trump made that.
Yeah, and he's right.
Trump declared war against Islam.
No, he didn't.
When Trump declared Jerusalem the capital of Israel, that was basically a declaration of war against Islam.
It depends on how you look at it. I don't think so.
You favor Trump, but were you ready to fight? And saying, well, you said it was a good move when Trump did it, but
yes, I did.
It was a declaration
of war
against Islam. And if
it depends on how you look at it,
you shouldn't have backed it.
No, it depends on how you look at it. It's not a declaration of war against Islam. It is a declaration of peace for the Jewish people and their capital, Jerusalem. Now, I'm not
like, no, Jerusalem is not the capital of Israel.
Jerusalem is the capital of Israel and of the Jewish people.
It is a Muslim city.
It is the Jewish capital of the Jewish state. It is where we have our seat of government, both political and spiritual. And I'm not suggesting that Muslims don't have a right to live there if they're willing to live there peaceably in the Jewish state. But I think that Israel absolutely has a reasonable expectation to not have tens of thousands of Muslims descend on Jerusalem. They can descend on Mecca. They can descend on Medina or on Tehran or Baghdad or Cairo. The Islamic world stretches across about 25% of the surface of this planet. It goes all the way from the Atlantic Ocean, the Cape of Dakar, all the way to the South Pacific. It goes all the way from the borders of Siberia down to the borders of South Africa.
You're just verifying what I'm saying, that we really are at war with Islam. And you're saying it's not the West, it's
right.
It's just us as Jews. So like we don't even.
No, I would only differentiate in that Islam is at war with us. Israel reaches a branch of peace to the Islamic world and
No, the
says
status quo is it's theirs. They're saying we're trying to change the status quo.
the status quo
is that
was what is theirs?
the Temple Mount and Jerusalem. That we
No,
took
not and
from
Jerusalem.
them.
After the 1967 war, the status quo was that the Waqf, which was Islamic religious authorities, would have religious say over the actual Temple Mount. That's the
I mean,
status quo.
we took whatever we have of Jerusalem through war.
Yeah, that's what conquest.
In your lifetime, when you were
alive. I know we
alive.
did, and I'm proud that we did. But the point is that Israel now has Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is the capital of the Jewish state. I mean, look, they took it by war before us. I mean, look, there was a war. Israel won that war. And by the way, it was after Jordan had actually started shelling.
I mean, is it
West
simple that
Jerusalem,
like
but we
Ramadan
can put that
happens
aside.
and Muslims get upset that they lost Jerusalem, and
They're upset that they lost all of Israel, Dooovid. That's even recently from the Jordan to the sea, Palestine will be liberated. No, this is a war against Israel. It's not Israelis and Jews fighting a war against Islam. The Israeli people have a modest and as by the way, as King Faisal bin Hussein acknowledged in his letter to Felix Frankfurter in 1918, and as he acknowledged in the Faisal-Weitzman Accord, which is part of the Paris Peace Conference after World War I, that Israel maintained modest and proper claims to its ancient homeland, and that he welcomed the Jewish cousins back to their ancient land to live peaceably alongside the emerging Arab empire and Arab nations. And I would say that, look, that's my position. That's Israel's position. It's obviously not yours, which is interesting.
I'm saying that your position is you're somewhat a declaration of war. And
it is not a declaration of war. It is a declaration of peace. Israel is Israel, and that it is willing to live in peace with the 22 Arab and Muslim states that surround it and that make up about, as I said, a quarter of the surface of the planet. It is a modest and a proper claim to a tiny swath of land. And even within that context, Arabs and Muslims are citizens of Israel. They can live peaceably in Israel and unmolested if they want to, and if they want to be peaceful, and if they want to recognize the Jewish state and the mission of the Jewish people, which is a modest and proper mission. It's not expansionist. Israel doesn't have any designs on conquering Syria or Jordan or Egypt. Israel has always extended the branch of peace to its Arab neighbors. And it is not, and the declaration of Jerusalem as the capital of Israel is not an act of war. It is an act of peace and of internal strength. It's a fulfillment of the spiritual destiny of the Torah and of the Jewish people, of what God told Abraham to do. I'm going to go up to the land that I will show you. This is something that is integral both politically and spiritually to the Jewish people. I mean, you say, "Oh, I'm talking Hasbara." I know you're going to say that. Fine. I don't talk
religiously. You're saying we will, rebuild our temple. Our religion is based on it.
Eventually, I don't know if that should happen right now, but I hope it happens at the proper time. And we've talked about this. I would argue that if we are reaching a point where we can rebuild the temple, it should be done in conjunction with Islamic spiritual leaders and even Islamic political leaders. It shouldn't be. I don't think the Jewish people have the strength politically and spiritually to go that far to rebuild.
The big summits also. So they had Egypt, Morocco, and the UAE leaders. I think it was the first time the Egyptian. I'm not sure if I don't think Mubarak himself, but one of the head of states came to Israel, and ironically, Blinken was there, and America was included. That kind of shows that of interest, but so militarily, Israel has strong agreements with the major Arab armies there.
Yeah, thanks to Trump.
What was saying? So Well, no, I mean, really, it was Blinken. I mean, it was Biden. It was Blinken who was.
Yeah, basically trying to advance what Trump put in place
And
with
I mean,
the
Blinken was
Abraham Accords.
Blinken was in Algeria trying to
I'm glad he is.
get
They
Algeria
continue.
to
Look, in
enter
certain
the
ways, this
Abraham
regime,
Accords.
yeah, in
Although
this
ironically,
regime,
he's
trying to
making
continue.
promises. He's making American promises for Algeria to enter the agreement, and also,
Good,
Egypt
I
and
hope
the
they do.
UAE. That America, it's not really an agreement between Israel. It's an agreement between Israel and America, because the UAE and Egypt, it's dependent upon uh, American diplomacy, American
Great.
military
Look,
aid,
I think all
American
sides benefit.
allowances.
All sides benefit from it. Israel, the Arab countries, and the United States benefit from having peace there.
Well,
So
it's not really. I mean, you just call it peace by saying really
it is peace. It's
mostly
normalization of
weapons.
relations.
It's mostly weapons agreements. I mean, the U.S. will be selling weapons to these
Yeah, so that
countries
they can have
in
peace through
turn for
strength.
them making agreement with Israel.
Sure, peace through strength. It is peace, literally. It's an end of hostilities. It's a normalization of relations. Yeah, it's peace.
And so you have a rise of ISIS and individual lone wolf violent
Well, that's
acts
going to be there
that
anyways.
they
And I think
expect
that
is
the
going to
more
increase.
normalization of between Israel and Arab and Muslim countries, part of that is that the radicals are suppressed and should be,
Well,
and
it's
they're
more
put
likely. I mean,
and
we
they're
argued
sent
about this in the
back.
past that they no longer have any demands for the Palestinian people. That Egypt, the UAE, Algeria will drop their demands about the Palestinian people in return for arms from America, and
Right.
so they'll make peace with Israel. And the main reason previously they hadn't made peace with Israel is because they had demands about certain things that they wanted rights or things given to the Palestinian people. So they're just going to drop any demands
I don't know if that's
Israel
totally
deals with
true,
the
Doug.
Palestinians.
Yeah, I don't know if
and
that's
largely
totally
in return for arms from America.
right, but I'm not sure it's totally true there, because before President Trump was driven out of office, they had what was called the Kushner Agreement on the table. And I think had Trump been allowed to serve his second term, the Palestinians would have come to that table and probably, I think, possibly agreed to that agreement, because it was a very reasonable one. It was certainly the best that they could hope for. And I don't think that I think there's always the possibility of that. But if you have a situation like you do now, where Palestinians are going out and endorsing and cheering and handing out dishes of candy when someone goes in and kills as many Jews as they can, it doesn't bode well for that kind of peace. They could be responsible players in that arrangement, and they're not. But and until they become, there won't be an agreement. Obviously,
the Palestinians aren't really a military threat to Israel.
No, but they're a threat to the Jewish people. They go in with machine guns and blow up Jewish men, women, and children.
Well, it's
and
like
as long as they do that, it's not the price of freedom.
All the shootings. Well, I'm saying the price of freedom in America is all the the random shootings, the mass shootings, the school shootings. So in Israel will have strong alignments with its neighboring military powers, but there'll be increased violence. So, God forbid.
No, that's not to be tolerated. And there's a difference to it, because yes, the price of freedom in the United States is that you occasionally have some nut go out and kill people. And we have a system of justice and a system of law enforcement. But we don't have a situation where that nut is endorsed by a subversive force that is trying to overthrow
states. I mean, saying the Palestinians will no longer, they might be endorsed by Iran, but they're no longer endorsed by the neighboring.
But they're implicitly aided by them.
Well, no,
it won't come out, and
historically, the Palestinian, even terrorism was aided by basically all the Arab countries.
Yeah.
So it's becoming basically that Iran is the only one that is aiding the Palestinians, and the other Arab countries will, so to say, turn a blind eye.
Yeah, but the Palestinians themselves have to disavow their attempt to destroy the state of Israel. They have to change their textbooks in schools that are anti-Semitic and filled with Jew hatred.
But it's
I hope
unlikely.
you'll admit that, David. Do you admit
I'm
that?
saying it's we're likely to see consistent.
Then fine. Then there won't be peace until they do it. And it may take 1,000 years, but until they disavow this ideology where they, rather than live peaceably alongside Israel in a Palestinian, quote, state, which I don't think can ever be a complete state.
I'm a one-stater. I'm saying, like, my opinion is more Israel is just going to have to give them all citizenship, but we don't have to argue.
Well, I actually agree with that, Dooovid. I think Israel should offer them citizenship.
That's not even on the table. Israel's not.
No, but I actually, you and I agree with that. I mean, I think that Palestinian Arabs, after 1 year of training and instruction, and after taking an oath of allegiance to Israel, there should be a path to citizenship for them. And those who refuse that citizenship should be basically expelled. But no, I think there should be citizenship for Palestinian Arabs if they're willing to become Israelis, and if they're willing to learn what that means and take a loyalty oath to the state of Israel and live by that oath, then yeah, they should become citizens. Israeli Arabs are citizens in Israel, and they're very successful citizens of Israel, I may add. There's nothing, that's not a problem, but they have to be loyal to the state. Just like we as Americans, if you immigrate to the United States, you have to take, I don't know if you realize this, but there is a process where, I mean, we're talking legal immigration here, where someone has to take instruction on what America is. They have to take a test to see if they know a little bit about American history and civics. It's pretty mild. And then they have to swear an oath of allegiance before a federal judge to the United States. And we expect them to be loyal to the United States. I think Israel ought to have that same process, although in Israel, because of the enmity, it has to be a little bit more vigorous. And we have to be sure, the Israelis have to be sure that the person becoming a citizen is going to be loyal to Israel.
Yeah, so I'm saying, like, our opinions on that are largely irrelevant. There's someone in the chat
Right.
who claims to be calling in.
Okay.
And likely, Israel is moving for strong military agreements with the Arab states, possibly everybody but Iran, and will just, God forbid, have to deal with high levels of violence with the Palestinians. And, what Israel wants, there's more people who want to completely expel the Palestinians than want to do what we're saying.
Well, Dooovid, I mean, if it really devolves into a civil war, and if the Palestinians really become all out at war with the state of Israel, then maybe there would have to be an expulsion ultimately. I'm not supporting that,
unfortunately, but
I'm not supporting that. But I'm saying that
there was mass violence.
Yeah, I mean, if it reaches a certain level, I mean, just as a matter of safety, as a matter of preserving the security of its own citizens, both Jew and non-Jew, by the way, Israel may have to expel people. I mean, they used to do this. If you had terrorists inside Israel who were killing Jews and who were basically engaging in subversive behavior, Israel would take them to the border and kick them out.
Well, I mean, that's why I said it's the rotating doors, that there's tens of thousands of people that have been in and out of the system, and there's nowhere really to send them. So they come right
Send
back
them to Syria.
And I was saying that's who's committing these terrorist acts, is these people that have been in the system.
If they come back, if they try to come back across the border, they should be shot. They obviously don't mean Israel well. They're trying to come in.
God forbid, that's basically the current situation,
right?
And that it would be, God forbid, like if you, like I said, that Israel might side with Russia, that it's just going to look at it as they're going to have a continual human rights crisis with the situation, and it'll be like Saudi Arabia and Yemen, where Palestine's not a military threat, but there's a terror threat, and it'll be a constant human right crisis. And I mean, that looks the direction. And
the only way Israel can in any way secure peace and security for its own people is to just do whatever it needs to do to do that. And I hope it doesn't come to mass expulsions. But if
Well,
it
they can do
does,
mass
then it's
expulsion
going
if
to
they
be
want to. I mean, God forbid. I mean, like genocide, like God forbid. 'Cause
genocide. No one's
there's nowhere to send them. There's no one going to take these people. So
No, no one's saying genocide. Don't even, I wouldn't even suggest that. Israel's not going to kill them all. They're going to send them to, maybe they'll
There's nowhere
send
to
them to
send
Los
them.
Angeles. I don't know. I mean,
Well, I mean, there's
look,
nowhere to send them. They're not going anywhere.
yes, there is. There's plenty of places to send them. They could go to Iraq. Anyway,
No, I mean,
Dooovid,
they're really. I mean, no place is going to take them. And it's saying
there
there's
are plenty of
no way to
Palestinians
negotiate.
that actually there are
There's no way
plenty.
to negotiate an expulsion.
You know something? There are
There's
plenty
no
of
country that-
Palestinians who live in the Gulf states, apparently.
I mean,
And-
there's no legal mechanism. There's no ally that Israel
It can,
has
you know, it
that they
can
would
happen.
be
It
able
doesn't
to
have to happen in
negotiate
bulk.
sort of
It would
mass
happen in
expulsion.
gradual means, and there are plenty of Arab states where Palestinians have pretty thriving communities, because after all, culturally speaking, the Palestinians are Israeli because
Yeah,
they've been
Detroit and Boston. You know, some guys
that's
in-
right, and they've been exposed to Israel, and they grew up
They're
with
going to do a
Israeli-
swap with you. They're going to get your house, and you're going to go to Israel. They're going to expel them, and they're going to take your lad, and you're going to.
They're going to expel me in Boston. I mean, if they want, if they
I was
come
saying
from-
that's the swap. I was saying they're going to come here, and we're going to go there.
No, I don't think so. I mean, they are here. Boston has a pretty good Palestinian community. And they're generally, as I say, they're culturally very Israeli. They're industrious, they're Western, they're fine. You know, they do well, basically. I mean, I know I'm generalizing in the
Well, no, I mean, God
communities where
forbid,
they
like
go.
Israel is saying that they're likely to be attacks on Muslim attacks on Jewish sites this Ramadan all across the world.
Yeah, I know that. That's how we started. I want to bring up another depressing subject, since we're on depressing subjects. And this one is more anecdotal in that I know somebody who is Israeli, actually happens to be a friend, who made anecdotal references to me to the arrival of Ukrainian refugees in Israel, most of whom are not Jewish. As you've pointed out, Dooovid, a lot of the Russians were not Jewish. And that some of them are openly anti-Semitic. They're actually vandalizing synagogues. They're actually, they're like neo-Nazis.
2 Ukrainians were killed this week in the terror. Unclear if they were Jewish or not.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, God forbid, it's tough to know. I had a guest on my channel yesterday, actually from Singapore, that had very good coverage, had these military maps, and was kind of pro-Russian leaning, but he did a lot of research and specifically creating these on-the-ground maps to kind of show what's going on. And I mean, it looks like Russia is, they've even announced that they've succeeded in largely taking the western regions that they wanted.
Right.
And they might expand. It's unclear whether they're going to take a few more towns to the Dnipro River, whether they're going to go to
take
Odessa.
Dnipropetrovsk.
It looks like Biden's Europe tour didn't really lead anywhere that.
No, all he did was wave a nuclear bomb. I mean, it almost caused World War III. But the thing is that my
He
understanding,
didn't do anything. He just ran his mouth.
yeah,
and
horrible.
maybe- and
Terror,
nothing
a
came of
complete
it.
disaster. But the what I've heard of it on this front, and my source on this is Jack Posobiec. I don't know if you listen to his podcast. He's very good. He's Human
I've
Events.
heard of him, but no, I don't listen to
He's
him.
he's pretty good. He's a former intelligence officer. He's in Washington. He has a lot of connections inside the White House, and he's not bad. I wouldn't totally buy everything, but he says he's been doing a lot of reporting on Ukraine, and he says that Ukraine and Russia are negotiating in Istanbul, and that they are really trying to hammer out a peace agreement, and that Zelensky is willing to come to some kind of an accommodation in terms of Russian sovereignty over Crimea and the Donbass, and also to maintain neutrality, which I think Ukraine should do. I don't think Ukraine, I mean, we've talked about this. They don't need to be at war with Russia. I mean, they should take the position that the Finland or Austria, these are countries that are neutral and are demilitarized. They don't want to, they agreed to not the idea of Ukraine right in the heart of Russia, siding with NATO, and that's kind of, I think, off the table, and they've agreed not to do that. They shouldn't do it.
It's kind of like Israel and Jerusalem. Like, no, I mean, Ukraine wants to win. They want to hold all of their territory.
But they're not going to win. They'll lose if they want to fight a war with Russia. Russia has only exposed, people say, oh, look at the Russian tanks are being destroyed. But the fact is that and again, my source on this is Jack Posobiec, that Russia has only sent in their kind of their older tanks. They have in reserve more tanks than, I think 3 times, 4 times as many tanks as Ukraine, and certainly as NATO, and that they're holding back. But if they want to crush Ukraine, they will. That's why Ukraine is negotiating. They can't have a warlike position against Russia. They're going to have to, in order to conduct themselves and to continue, they're going to have to take a neutral position. I personally think they should be neutral. I don't think that that would be like a Palestinian entity having an alliance with Iran and allowing Iran to build bases, a few miles away from Tel Aviv. If there's going to be a Palestinian entity, it has to be neutral. It can't have that. It can't have that. So I think that in a way, Ukraine is similar in that way. They're very close to Russia. They've got a 1,000-mile border with Russia. They're a stone's throw away from Moscow. They can't expect to have take an enemy position and survive. It's going to be a war. It's just that simple. And so I think that Zelensky, who I think is leading, he could lead his country to ruin. I think that he is realizing that, hopefully, and he's taking a more conciliatory stand toward Russia, which will result in peace, or at least a cessation of hostilities.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty unclear what's going to be. And I followed those negotiations in Turkey. Russia has at least backed off a little bit in like Kiev, but they don't want.
Russia's goal is not to conquer all of Ukraine. It never was. Its goal is basically, I think, a relatively reasonable goal, which is to have a demilitarized and neutral Ukraine. And yeah, they have some territorial claims. They do, let's not forget, I mean, Ukraine, if you look at history, the whole country was basically created by Stalin, who drew the borders and who handed over Crimea to this new Ukrainian entity. Before that, before World War II, I suppose probably actually before World War I, Western Ukraine was part of Poland. And it had been for many, many centuries. And Eastern Ukraine was Russian. I mean, it's not like, it's kind of a manufactured state anyways. And I think that Russia, basically recognizes that there is a strong Polish nationalist movement, and rightfully, and I support that, but that it has to sort of coexist with Russia as a.
Are they going to go for Odessa? Yeah, I guess there's a
no, they're not. Odessa it has a big Russian population, but Russia doesn't. I don't think Russia, I'm talking from Jack Posobiec, and he's got a lot of sources in Eastern Europe. He's Polish himself, and he's got family. That Russia doesn't have designs on Odessa. They do have designs on Crimea, which is something like 98% Russian native and Russian speaking, and which is essential for Russia's defense. I mean, it's ports in the Mediterranean, and they also have designs on the eastern border. But beyond that, I don't think Russia expects to occupy the rest of Ukraine. They expect a neutral Ukraine, and I think that's actually reasonable. Ukraine shouldn't be in a war footing with Russia any more than Finland should. It's sort of like that. Look, Finland, after World War II, they agreed that they would not join NATO, that they would basically, no, I don't want to use the word kowtow, but they would basically check their foreign policy with Russia and maintain like a friendly relations with Russia. And the result is that Finland is one of the most prosperous nations in the world today. It's a startup nation. I mean, it's an incredibly successful society. So
I was saying that people were believing their own propaganda, and as it so to say, the propaganda that's been the news in Ukraine, sees that really they're losing the war and they're going to have to surrender. That it'll fade from the news, just like other travesties around the world, where it'll just go on and it'll fade from the news. In international material, in Ukraine, will just be in a bad situation. They'll see that no one's going to come and help them, and
And they'll sue for peace, hopefully. Zelensky tried to get the whole world to come in, and that's not going to happen, apparently. Germany still is, maintaining pipelines with Russia. They're not, NATO has made it pretty clear they're not going to go to war. So I think Ukraine is going to, they did not succeed in getting Europe to go to war for them, unfortunately. Does anybody in their right mind think that it's a good idea to have a war with Russia, nuclear Russia? The American policy since Truman has been, and both Democratic and Republican, is to avoid war with Russia.
I thought Patton said, at least it's in the movie, that they should have kept the tanks rolling and taken over Russia.
Yeah, but that was before Russia got nukes.
But saying no, that you could say that the U.S., we're just scared, and
and rightfully,
we should have an official policy of regime change.
Mutual
just like Iran, that we should have an official policy of regime change, and
no,
we should not. Well, because we're scared,
and we shouldn't have it anyways. Russia has a right to its own regime. Patton was before Russia, thanks to the Rosenberg spy ring, the atomic spy ring, got nukes. Russia is a nuclear power. They've got more sophisticated nukes than we do. They have apparently battlefield nukes that could strike selectively. You don't want to go to war with Russia. America's policy has been to avoid war with Russia. And right now, we are closer to a nuclear war than we've been at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it is a DEFCON 3, which is part of the Pentagon, actually has a clock which estimates the number of minutes that we're away from a nuclear war. And it has never been less than it is right now since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that's a lot of that is the fault of Biden and this illegitimate regime. So anyway, no, we don't want to have a nuclear war with Russia.
Yeah,
Russia has legitimate interests in Ukraine. And I think that's, and this idea that Russia wants to conquer Europe is not really true. And I think that hopefully the Zelensky now realizes that he has nowhere else to go. And that's why he's talking along the shores of the Bosphorus to bring about a peace.
Well, I mentioned last week, like where there's a whole bunch of, thank God the U.S. is relatively militarily safe, that, our troubles are internal. Economically, we probably have a lot of troubles facing us in the direction of the nation.
We wouldn't be so safe if we had a war with Russia. We could see nuclear bombs in American cities. That's insane.
I'm saying war with Russia, but it's saying just that our official policy could be regime change. That it's
no, I don't think we should be doing regime change. Putin was elected in Russia. He's very popular there. It's none of our business as long as they're not engaging in aggression against.
Yeah, but it's similar to Iran. That to some extent.
No, it was a disaster having a regime change in Iran.
Regime change, even though they also.
No, we shouldn't do it there either. It was a disaster when in the 1950s, the CIA and President Eisenhower, at the behest of Churchill, who called him, and where there were oil interests, allowed the CIA to effect a coup d'etat against Mohammad Mossadegh. That has poisoned relations with Iran ever since. It was wrong. We should not be doing that. We don't have any business having regime change in other countries, as long as they're not engaging in war with us. We did it in Guatemala. We did it we tried to do it in Indonesia, and we did it in Ukraine in 2014. I think that's now come out. Victoria Nuland, Undersecretary of State, you had McCain, you had other people fomenting a coup d'etat in Ukraine against their elected government of Yanukovych, who was elected. He was a legitimate head of state. The coup had a lot to do with getting Ukraine into the orbit of NATO and the European Union, which was wrong. We have no business doing that. It was
So
warlike.
the U.S. could
And it's
consider
cause of
winding
this war
down-
right now.
Trump invested a lot in the military, but the U.S. could consider winding down the military and the expense that we put into the military, and just recognize that we're no longer a global power like that.
No, I don't agree with that.
Try to worry about our problems, at home, and because you're relatively.
No, because if we do that, there'll be a vacuum that'll be filled by other countries that might be a lot more aggressive. I mean, I support. I'm not in isolation.
That's not our problem. It's saying that.
No, but at the same time, we have to have
we can keep ourselves safe.
we have to have a
Bring
military that can
resources
fight a
that we're
war on
not
two
reliant
fronts.
We're not.
And we have to be in a position to help our allies. I mean, I'm not an isolationist in that way. I don't think we should have wars, and I don't think we should be engaging in regime change. But we have to maintain a strong position in the world. That's just reality. Because if we don't, China will, Russia will, and who knows who else. It's a balance of power issue. It's the real world. I'm not saying we need to engage in what Charles Austin Beard called perpetual war for perpetual peace, which has been the American policy since World War I. That's wrong. But we have to maintain, as Ronald Reagan said, peace through strength. I don't
even think we can if we wanted. I mean, saying we want to, but we can't. And so we're going to have to deal with our problems. And people in America, like happening in Ukraine, we're to see that we don't really have any power to do anything about this. And our problems facing us.
We don't have any business doing anything about it. Do we want to go to war for a border conflict in Eurasia between Russia and Ukraine? That's not our business. We should be worrying about our border with Mexico right now. I don't know if you've been following the fact that there's hundreds of thousands of people heading for the border in Mexico. That's we have our own border problems. We don't need to worry about the Donbass. That's not our business. I feel bad for the people there. I mean, but at the same time,
we want to worry about Israel. I mean, the same way that they say that Blinken's there in Algeria offering, American benefits to Algeria to make peace with Israel, and even largely.
I think that benefits the United States also, Dooovid. I mean, it benefits both Israel, Algeria, and the United States because it creates a peaceful posture. It's economically good. It's politically good. It's militarily good. Why not have a military friend there? You have enemies.
Because we're agreeing to allow those countries to invest in America, allow increased immigrations from those countries, and you're further expanding the military complex that the peace with Israel is dependent upon military alliances and engagement, weapons dealing. And
I think it reduces the military complex that's anti-American and anti-Israel. And it basically shifts it more toward the side of the West. It's not disrespecting the sovereignty of Algeria or any other country. It's not.
I'm saying Russia called their bluff. Saying for Algeria or the UAE, like Iran doesn't have the power to call our bluff, and so we're arming, Saudi Arabia and UAE, and the peace agreement with Israel, because Iran doesn't have the power to call our bluff. But Russia had the power to call our bluff.
Well, I don't know about that. I mean,
we tried to do the same thing with
Ukraine. If we wave a military sword at Russia, it's driving Russia in the hands to form a sort of a new axis with Iran and with China.
Well, I said we're giving weapons we're selling weapons to the UAE, Saudi Arabia, more Egypt, more Arab countries, and the same way that Russia, Iran doesn't have the power to call our bluff, in the sense that Iran doesn't like us arming Saudi Arabia and UAE, but they can't do anything about it. Just like Russia didn't like us arming the Ukraine, but Russia called our bluff and invaded.
Right.
And, so if Iran called our bluff, and to some extent Iran is doing that they're arming the Yemenites, they're arming Hezbollah.
Sure, they're aggressive. They want to have the return of a caliphate. They have borders. They've got borders on. They've got forces on the border of Israel with tens of thousands.
It's really no different what we tried to do in Ukraine than we're doing with Saudi Arabia or these other countries. Just that Russia called our bluff and we failed.
I'm not exactly sure what you mean by that, but what I will say is that it's
I said
troubling.
we were trying to arm Ukraine, just like
No,
we're making these
but the
deals.
thing is,
We were trying to arm the Ukraine, and it failed.
there's a little difference though. But I mean, I get arming Ukraine to
Well,
help
the
them
difference is
defend.
that Russia came in and kicked their, destroyed them, as
Yeah.
opposed to Iran doesn't have the power to, destroy the countries that were arming next to them.
Well, I think that Iran basically has gone in and created a client state in both Iraq and Syria. So I'm not sure they don't have the power to do that. But
Well, that we're still, selling or giving Israel, airplanes, and they're
I
bombing them.
understand that. But the thing is,
And,
Iran has gone in and they've taken advantage of the instability in Iraq with the death of Saddam Hussein to basically take over that country and Syria as well. But I think that as far as Ukraine goes, it's one thing to help them have enough weapons to defend themselves. It's another thing for the U.S. I don't want to say officially, but I think U.S. interests investing in things like biological facilities, which is really
what's the
really
difference
ugly.
between Saudi Arabia and UAE and Ukraine, besides the fact that we lost?
I don't know what I really don't know what you're getting at here, Dooovid.
Well, I mean, the U.S., so to say Israeli foreign policy, that we're arming those countries, and
Israel doesn't have any aggressive designs on its neighbors. Israel
is arming Ukraine. That is
Israel's arming Ukraine.
But Israel's biggest one of the biggest economic sectors is arms dealer, and
Right.
saying the Abraham Accord deals are mostly dependent on arms deals.
Not mostly. I think that's part of it.
The single biggest part, and saying even Trump that it was like a huge amount. It was like $100 billion.
So Israel is
that the Abraham
helping.
Accords opened up the UAE to purchase like hundreds of over $100 billion.
They have defensive needs.
Weaponry, even Saudi Arabia.
Right. They have defensive needs. I mean, the U.S. has always supplied Saudi Arabia with military aid going all the way back to World War II. And before that, it was the British. That's part of the power balance. I mean, it's, and yeah, there is definitely a competition or a power
we wanted to do that
break between Saudi Arabia and Iran.
We just had our bluff called, and saying that Iran has tried to.
I think with Ukraine, it's a little different though, because Ukraine, as we talked about, is traditionally a part of Russia. It's in the heart of Russia. And also, look, I don't want to go into this because we're on YouTube, but there is an aspect to Ukraine that's very corrupt. And you have oligarchs there, and in Russia too, but in Ukraine that have basically corrupted various American officials, American families, American interests, let's just say, and that there's a lot of money involved. I think that a part of our defense of Ukraine is to defend these people. I'm not going to mention who they
Saudi
are.
Arabia or UAE or Qatar.
Well, because Saudi Arabia is different in that Saudi Arabia was, as I said, I mean, we had Franklin Roosevelt agreed to a protectorate relationship with Saudi Arabia when he was on his way back from Yalta. He met with King Saud on a ship outside of Alexandria. And
there's more money and corruption involving Saudi Arabia than
that may be, but the point is that it played a major role in, first of all, they have oil, and secondly, it played a major role in the balance of power during the Cold War with the Soviet Union, and that we basically took over from the British, which had been the protectorates of Saudi Arabia going back to the 19th century. Anyway, Dooovid, we're kind of reaching toward the end of the program. What do you have coming up on your show?
Well, I had that interview with this man, Wyatt from Singapore, who had this extremely good coverage of Ukraine. Already has almost 500 views. His YouTube channel blew up like literally in tens of subs. He had been covering mostly Asia and but he started covering Ukraine, and because it's good coverage and mostly visual. He has basically talks through maps and updated maps. So I wrote an article I talked to you, like last week about writing, and then Jennifer on my week in review was encouraging me. So I wrote a article I posted on my Twitter on the hero's journey in music, a way, a little like Hasidic understanding than like a Joseph Campbell, his hero's journey on music. So I'll talk about that more.
Great, I like Joseph Campbell.
might-
His analysis of the Occident and the Orient, good stuff.
I had spoken to John David Ebert. I'm not sure if I reach out, maybe you get an interview with him. I know he's kicking out. He had worked for the Joseph Campbell Foundation.
Yeah, I'm interested. I like
I had him
Campbell.
on my channel, but I might do a stream on my channel on that. You're probably not this week. The Science of Consciousness conference
Mhm.
with Stuart Hameroff and Roger Penrose in Arizona, University of Arizona, is coming up in 3 weeks. So I think I'm going to pay to attend like Zoom. It's actually like $300, but I think I'm going to attend. Maybe I'll do a few streams covering that, and might be more technical, related to the science of consciousness. So
Okay.
that I'll be preparing. So I don't think I have any streams on my channel coming up this week, or possibly the next week. I'll do the one covering the hero's journey in music. I'm not sure if Robert Stark, I could reach out to him again, that if he to set up an interview.
Thank you. Yeah.
I didn't try Andrew Wilson again, the Crucible,
Okay.
like scheduling. I want to keep on messaging him. I'm not sure if he wanted to do it or not, but
I do, but I mean, I have to say, I've been somewhat distracted by putting the finishing touches on my latest book, The Biden Coup, the socioeconomic consequence of an illegitimate regime. It's just going to the galleys now this week. I'm really finally tightening it up, and it's almost ready to go. And so
that's pretty important. I watched that PBS Frontline thing on.
You saw about the elections deal?
The ProPublica, yeah, and I mean, God forbid we'll have to.
Well, we can't talk about that too much on YouTube.
YouTube and at the point where that's almost like guaranteed to get you shut down. I saw Kevin Michael Grace.
Yeah, I'm not going to talk about that. I mean,
an article just mentioning a news story from VDare or something like that got a 10-day suspension on YouTube. But good for you to write, and it's pretty important.
And I'm going to have different outlets which will interview me, and it's my thesis is basically that given the fact that about 60%, even now, of Republicans polled believe that the election was not legitimate, including in Massachusetts, 69% of Republicans, according to the Paleologos poll. And Paleologos is an excellent pollster. He's been around in our state for a long time. They believe that the election was not legitimate. And that's, so you can imagine the percentage in states like Arkansas or Wyoming. It's probably a lot higher than that. So given this fact, it's time to talk about this. I'm not calling in my book or now for the Biden administration to not be in office. I don't believe in the idea of decertifying. I think there'll be an election in 2024. It's too late. The results were, let's just say what happened was successful. It happened.
Let's just save this for other platforms, because then
well, I'm not going into it.
You'll get cut on YouTube, and even if you're right, and it's really tough to know.
But I just want to be clear to the YouTube censors that I'm not.
You're right.
I understand. You're right, and that's why I'm just kind of covering my tracks.
I wouldn't even play games like hinting and.
No, I'm not hinting at all. I'm saying it flatly. Biden is the president.
Platforms.
No. I'm not hinting anything. My book says in writing, and I'm saying right now, Joseph R. Biden is the president. He was inaugurated. Kamala Harris is vice president. She was inaugurated. That is how our system worked. And I'm not seeking to change that, except, of course, 3 years from now when we have an election, when I believe Donald Trump will be reelected. But this is our system. I accept it. I'm not trying to subvert it at all. I'm simply saying that unless we come to terms with how they became president, we're never going to have another honest election in this country. That's all I'm saying. My purpose is not to in any way change the nature of our government. I'm not, nor am I in any way subversive about that.
By the time I encourage you to write your book, and definitely covering the important topic. I just wouldn't even bother trying to skip around the YouTube and just
Maybe not. We'll see how it goes.
Just
There's plenty of people.
make
There's plenty of
mention
people who I
if you're
could
gonna
talk
talk
to.
about that, do it on
Yeah,
the
look, I mean,
platform.
I don't know what will happen on YouTube, but there's plenty of people I could talk to on Rumble.
I'd say you'll get cut, like I'd say almost guaranteed.
Probably. I would also note that there are plenty of still old-fashioned radio shows and radio
Yeah, I don't think
stations.
you'll get cut on Rumble or Odyssey.
No, I
on the
won't.
platform.
And even like if you go to like WRKO here in Boston, which is a 50,000 watt mega station, Jeff Cooner is saying things that would probably be cut on YouTube about the past election.
Well,
and
I
does
think what
so
we're doing for YouTube
and does so
then-
regularly. And I think Jeff Cooner would probably interview me. So I don't really need to do it on YouTube. I know that but I think that, and I think also frankly, the censorship on YouTube is starting to crumble a little bit. Like, for example, even in the mainstream media, they are now publicly talking about Hunter Biden's laptop, which is something that was forbidden. That's now on, apparently NBC, ABC, they're talking about that now. So
they're still getting cut on YouTube.
I'm sure they are. But the point I'm making here is that in general, the regime of political censorship is starting to show signs of crumbling. So anyway, Dooovid,
but yeah,
and I don't want to be the one to test it.
So if you have it ready, maybe next week we just avoid YouTube and
we'll do it. I'll just do
better interaction on YouTube.
That's right. I won't turn YouTube on. I have 9 other live stream venues, including Rumble, which is the main one, and I'm heard on about 35 different podcasts and audios. I don't need to run it on YouTube. YouTube is they have their own universe, and they no longer rule. I mean, I think that their attempt to completely censor all politics has basically failed because there are so many other venues. Anyway, Dooovid, listen, thanks again. I mean, God willing, we'll have peace in Passover for the Jewish people and for the people of the world. It's just it's a time when we can pray for peace and we can pass the ammunition. Anyway,
Dooovid, be careful, stay alert, and me and Charles will do the best to keep you best of our ability to keep you updated. So Shabbat Shalom and take care.